2. What's up, Truth Seekers? Welcome back. This is going to be a really tough one, and the reason is I've wanted to have this guest on for a long time. Before I start, I just want to tell you that I heard a comedian the other day say something that really hit home for me. He talked about how, you know what I hate? I hate judgmental people. I hate people on their moral high horse always walking around telling you what to do and what you're screwing up at. And he goes, then I realized after a few years when I got my life cleaned up that those judgmental people were actually just people who really loved me and cared about me and wanted the best for me and hated watching myself self-destruct doing really stupid things every single day. And that's kind of how I feel about my next guest. He is the author of The History of Jihad, and he's been called some really horrible things in his last 2 decades of studying Islam and Muhammad and the behaviors and virtues and beliefs of these people. And now I wonder if he just goes to bed at night thinking, what if the Islamophobes are right? And that's what I'm going to title the talk today. What if Islamophobes are right? Mr. Robert Spencer, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for being on the show. Peace be upon you and whoever, if you follow right guidance.
Thank you. Peace be upon you as well. Or peace be upon those who follow the right guidance.
What does that even mean, what I just said?
Well, the peace be upon you, assalamu alaikum, is the greeting that a Muslim is to give to another Muslim, but not to non-Muslims. To non-Muslims, a Muslim is supposed to say, peace be upon those who follow the right guidance. That is, peace be upon us and not you. And Osama bin Laden and his communiques declaring jihad against the United States, you see him saying it. People don't realize the implications of these things. They pop up all over the place.
So it's funny to me because when I read that in your book, I thought that's not very diverse. That's not very accommodating and loving, compassionate of other types of people. But that's a new thing. It hasn't always been that way, right?
Not a whole lot of diversity or multiculturalism in the book. The book is one long 1,400-year record of one culture and religion violently imposing itself upon others. And this is a 1,400-year war now.
Well, before we get too deep into that, my voice almost cracked from laughing. Keith Ellison, recently, for people who don't know who he is, he's one of the leaders of the Democratic National Committee, pretty close ties to CARE and Islamic organizations. He actually wrote a letter to Jeff Bezos, help me if I'm stating this incorrectly, that they should not be selling your book. Are you worried that he's going to come and find you and try to slap you around?
Well, let's be, to be completely clear, he didn't actually name me or the book. But what he did say was that he was very disturbed to see that Amazon was selling books by people who had been designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I have been designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. In reality, the real hate group is the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tries to demonize legitimate voices that are not leftist by lumping us in with the likes of real hate groups like the KKK and neo-Nazis, and acting as if we're all the same, when in reality my work has all been in the defense of the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of rights of all people before the law, things that no sane person could oppose. So anyway, yeah, Ellison wants all the books by people on the SPLC's blacklist to be dropped, and that would include me.
Couching your bigotry and cloaking it in free speech. That sounds like something a hateful person would do. I want everyone to keep an eye on this because it's going to be hard to distinguish the two. I'm being sarcastic, of course. And so I have recommended your website, jihadwatch.org, at least 2 or 3 dozen times to people that I know. I have to do a warning, though. If you go there and you have high blood pressure, it could be dangerous. The things that are posted there on a daily basis are a little disturbing, and I want to catch on one of those as we talk about your book. But what do you say to those who claim that you, Mr. Spencer, are the problem, and Muslims could exist peaceably in a world where people like you would quit smearing them and saying horrible things that incite them to violence and basically force them to do the things that they do that give them such a bad rap?
Well, let's be clear. Again, inciting people to violence is telling people to do violent acts, and I've never done that. What you're referring to is Muslims reacting violently to what I say. What I say is that the Quran teaches that they should be violent toward unbelievers, which is a readily demonstrable fact, and that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was violent toward unbelievers, another readily demonstrable fact, and that Muslims are so angry about people exposing these things that they will become violent as a result. This is unfortunately the case, but it wouldn't be me inciting them. It would be their own texts and teachings inciting them to violence. Anyway, yeah, you're right. It's very common. As a matter of fact, probably most people who know of me at all think that I'm the problem rather than the solution. And they think that Islamophobia, so-called, is a bigger problem than jihad terror. But in reality, there are 33,000 jihad terror attacks around the world since 9/11, and no verified Islamophobic attacks. There have been attacks ascribed to Islamophobia, and even then, they're only a handful, and those are all questionable. People say, when I spoke last year at Stanford University, there was a number of professors that claimed that students would be violent as a result of what I'd said, that they'd be all stirred up by hatred and go out and beat up Muslim students. This is just leftist fantasy. This has never happened. I don't think it ever will happen. Never called for violence, approved of violence, condoned violence, nothing. I'm talking about a violent ideology and opposing it and seeking peaceful solutions that would ensure the survival of free societies. That's all I'm doing. The idea that that is Islamophobic is really just a propaganda tactic on the part of the left and Islamic supremacist groups in the West to silence any criticism of jihad, which would have the effect of enabling it to proceed unopposed and unimpeded.
I was hoping with the provocative title of "What if the Islamophobes are right?" that anyone who hears the word of Islamophobe would automatically be triggered to look at your book and look at the information and say, why would they want to paint this person with that pejorative? And so what I did when I got the book is I started in the back, and because you basically have a chronology of Islam from start to finish over 1,400 years. And many people have said it's your best book. I think you've repeated that. And I've only read one other one that you have because I've only known about you for about a year or so, but I have to say it's fantastic. I'd recommend people go and get it. I want to start from the back because this is a person who allegedly on his deathbed said two interesting things. He said, if I live, if Allah wills, I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arab Peninsula. And he also said, I have been made victorious with terror. And those are themes that are pretty prominent today in terms of the jihad against non-believers. I also read in the book something was confusing. A lot of things are confusing. The Quran forbids a Muslim to kill another Muslim. Are those three things true or untrue?
Yeah, well, it was Muhammad who said, I have been made victorious with terror, and I will expel all the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula. Those things are in Islamic tradition. That's why, actually, there is terrorism, because Muhammad is the excellent example for all Muslims, according to chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran. And the Quran also tells Muslims to strike terror in the enemies of Allah. That's chapter 8, verse 60. And Allah says he will strike terror in the unbelievers. That's chapter 3, verse 151. So you've got Allah in the Quran several times, also chapter 8, verse 12. And then Muhammad saying he's been made victorious with terror. This is why terror has always been, as I show in the book, a tactic of Islamic jihad warfare. And what was the other thing? I'm sorry, I'm getting old. I can't remember these compound questions so well.
I must be old too, because I'm having a hard time. We talked about those two, and also, so killing another Muslim.
Yeah, killing another Muslim don't kill another Muslim that's based on chapter 4, verse 92 of the Quran, which explicitly forbids a Muslim to kill another Muslim. And so what you have throughout Islamic history is not Muslims refraining from killing other Muslims, but Muslims declaring takfir, which is kind of like excommunication, declaring that another Muslim group is not Muslim, and then they can kill them.
So I've probably got a page of notes from the last chapter here. It's hard to know where to start. So let's go with George Bush. You talked about the speech, and here's a direct quote from your book where you said, it was an exercise in vassalage that would have made the late 14th and early 15th century Byzantine emperors ashamed. Yet Bush was by no means alone. Political leaders all over the West echoed his words about Islam being a religion of peace, having nothing to do with terrorism. After September 11th, this became a commonplace of the Western political discourse, rejected only by a small minority who were quickly stigmatized as cranks and Islamophobes. Let's start with that.
Well, that's pretty much sums up the modern world, sums up the contemporary situation. That's it right there. I tell you something. I wrote this book more or less chronologically because I've been doing this for a long time. Right. I had the material all at hand. It wasn't something that was going to make me need to do a lot of research to find out what had happened. I knew what had happened. I just had to write it down. And so I wrote it more or less chronologically. Occasionally, I came across some sources that I thought would be good to put in and went back and put them in. But mostly, I wrote it from beginning to end, which is kind of unusual for me anyway in writing books. And so the point is that I had written 14 centuries of unremitting jihad warfare with no reformation, no reconsideration, no era of tolerance or coexistence, but just war of Muslims against non-Muslims. And so after writing all that, I get to 9/11 and I write about that. And then I thought, let me now put in George W. Bush's speech at the mosque in front of the al-Qaeda financier Abdurrahman al-Amoudi and the Hamas Muslim Brotherhood Front Group CARE leader Nihad Awad. What did he say at the mosque? And I went to get the speech, and he says, of course, Islam is peace, and let's not be unkind to Muslims who've been facing discrimination and harassment in the U.S., which wasn't true. And it really hit me. It hit me more than it hit me at the time that he actually said it. Coming after all this war, coming after all this jihad for 1,400 years, I thought this is a myopia, a misstep, a false statement of monstrous proportions that has deformed our policies in regard to the jihad threat ever since. And I'm hoping that some people who have some power and influence will ultimately read this book so that they can change these policies that have been based on fantasy and wishful thinking ever since Bush said that.
And you kind of, in terms of chronologically, you kind of go over some of the other statements in the administration and the steps they took. I like to say the things they would do if they were trying to harm the country and endanger its citizens rather than actually protect our interests. You quote Marie Harf in 2014 saying the president's been very clear that ISIL does not operate in the name of any religion. You quote John Brennan, and I will let you talk about what he said. And then there was a retort from some Islamic leaders to John Kerry, who they called the uncircumcised geezer, and said, who are he and Barack Obama? They think they know. I'm going to mess up the quote. They believe they're Islamic authorities, almost in jest. And you go on to detail Hillary Clinton and all the other people that basically are being mocked by the Islamic State, acting like they have any idea what they're talking about while they're creating policies that are going to affect our lives. Can you help shed some light on some of the more impactful things that were in the chapter?
Yeah, well, there are all these learned imams that were in the Obama administration. Obama himself, John Kerry, Brennan, Marie Harf, who would pronounce on what Islam was and wasn't. And none of these people were Muslims, at least openly. Of course, there are a lot of rumors about Obama himself and rumors about Brennan that I think are better founded, because Brennan, according to my friend John Guandola, who was in the FBI, that while he was an agent, he said it was an open secret that Brennan had converted to Islam while he had been serving in Saudi Arabia. And that's consistent with his statements that are in the book about jihad. He clearly shows the knowledge of Arabic, which is not surprising if he were a convert to Islam, because you have to pray in Arabic if you're a Muslim, and so you would learn Arabic if you're converting to Islam. And he was downplaying the idea of jihad as violent and putting forth plainly deceptive notions about jihad being peaceful. He also oversaw the removal of any mention of Islam and jihad from counterterror training, and hamstrung our ability to know the enemy by making it forbidden to do so. And so you have all these people who are ostensibly non-Muslims, and they are telling us what Islam is and isn't. And ISIS responded actually to Pope Francis when he said, I've got the book here, see, and he said, Pope Francis said, authentic Islam and the proper understanding of the Quran reject every form of violence. And that's when ISIS actually answered him. And they made it very clear what they were all about. They said, we hate you, first and foremost, because you are disbelievers. Now, that in itself should have opened some eyes in Washington as well as in Rome. We hate you because you're disbelievers. That's not, we hate you because you helped establish or recognize the state of Israel, or because you invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, or whatever else people think all this came from. We hate you because you are disbelievers. You reject the oneness of Allah, whether you realize it or not, by making partners for him in worship. The idea is that in Islam that Christians have made partners with Allah in worship. They've, in essence, committed idolatry by worshiping Jesus as the Son of God because he's not God in the Islamic view, and consequently, to worship him is to associate a partner with Allah and commit idolatry. And the conclusion of this statement, which goes on quite some quite a long while, says the fact is they claim all these grievances, of course, that Muslims are supposedly being terrorized by American troops and so on, Western troops. So then they say the fact is, even if you were to stop bombing us, imprisoning us, torturing us, vilifying us, and usurping our lands, we would continue to hate you, because our primary reason for hating you will not cease to exist until you embrace Islam. So see, what they're doing is they are obeying the Quranic principle, which is in chapter 8, verse 39, fight until religion is all for Allah. It's very clear. Fight until religion is all for Allah, not fight in self-defense, as is the common view today that, well, yes, Islam allows for defensive jihad. The Islamic apologists lie about this all the time and say things like that. Fight until religion is all for Allah is a maximalist statement that you're going to keep fighting everybody in the world until the hegemony of Islam is established. That's an open-ended declaration of war against the entire world. It's 1,400-year-old declaration of war, and in the book I show that for 1,400 years there have been Muslims in every place who have obeyed it and waged war against unbelievers.
You do it really. And just so we're clear, what year was that quote to Pope Francis?
About 2014, I believe.
So not exactly ancient history.
No, it might be 15 even, maybe even 16, but it's relatively recent.
Apologize for compounding again, but there's two things here. One is the division people are able to make in their minds between what they see as the radical sect of Islam and the rationalization of, well, most of the people that I know, most of the people that I encounter, most of the people that are out there that are Muslim, they don't believe that. Like, they have no interest in it. And then what you go back to in the book is, as you said, detailing 1,400 years of the specific leaders, the times, the places, and the Quranic verses that establish and reinforce this behavior, and that it's an unbroken chain. You go back all the way to the Islamic Golden Age, of the period when I think Muhammad had just died, and said this is considered the height of the original. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt,
Please.
but I said I could go all the way back to Muhammad. The first chapter is all about Muhammad's jihad warfare. Then the second
Peace
chapter
be upon him.
Second chapter is the Islamic Golden Age.
That's right. That's right. And basically, you make the point, maybe even ironically, that there was no lack of cultural appropriation back then. Cultural, well, let's just call it what it is. There were honor killings, there were beheadings, there were the breast test was really nice, where they walk around and check the infidel's breast size and make sure that everything's nice and tight. And just really horrible, atrocious behavior that we associate with the Dark Ages that was justified then as it is now with the verses and then the hadiths that are in the Quran. So why the division? Why the government rationalizing this behavior and saying, look, it isn't what, the more you learn about it, the more you have to say it isn't what it appears to be.
Well, the government thinks that if they cover up these things, I mean, of course, this is less so under Trump, but it's certainly true of the governments of Western Europe and Canada still, and of many, many people in Washington, many, many people in the entrenched bureaucracy. They still think that if we say Islam is a religion of peace, then we will encourage the moderate voices within Islam. We will not validate this is something Obama used to say all the time, that if he said that there was an Islamic terrorism, then that would validate Al-Qaeda and ISIS's claim to be Islamic, and they weren't Islamic. And I was thinking, wait a minute, who's going to validate it to who?
Right.
You know, I mean, here's Obama. Here's John Kerry used to say this too, and Kerry's clearer because there aren't any rumors about him that he's a Muslim. So let's take Kerry. Kerry says we don't want to validate Al-Qaeda and ISIS by saying they're Muslim. So he's expecting us to believe that there is some Muslim somewhere who is maybe about to join Al-Qaeda or ISIS. But then he hears the non-Muslim American Secretary of State say that ISIS isn't Islamic, and so he thinks, oh, well then, I won't join them. It's ridiculous beyond measure. These people don't take their understanding of Islam from a non-Muslim political leader. They take their understanding of Islam from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from Islamic leaders. It would be like saying that if there were some sect of Christianity that were that was violent or something. And the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran said, "Oh, these people aren't really Christians," and expecting the Christians then who were in this violent sect to say, "Oh, well, the Ayatollah Khamenei says we're not Christians. We better cut it out." It would be just that absurd. Christians don't understand Christianity based on what Muslim leaders say, and it's the same thing in reverse.
That's a really good point. There's a commenter on another page who said, "I really wish the interviewer had asked why." So I'm going to ask the question: why hasn't the Trump administration righted many of the wrongs of the commie Muslim admin of Imam Obama and the banning of any member of Jihad or Islam in the FBI, CIA, or other agency trainings, the firing of people, and the hiring of people like Robert Spencer as advisors, etc.? What do you think?
Well, I don't think that they would ever hire me because I'm so tainted, and I'm not really genuinely tainted. I haven't done anything wrong. I have no criminal record, and all of my work, as I said before, is in line defending constitutional principles and universally accepted ideas of human rights. But the Southern Poverty Law Center and various other leftist advocacy groups, they claim that I'm an anti-Muslim extremist and hateful and so on. And so I know that they don't want the heat for that kind of an appointment. Look at the heat they got for hiring even various watery figures like Sebastian Gorka and so on, who don't really speak about this problem with a view to what really the root causes of it are. And so they would never dare. I'm not waiting by the phone for Trump to call. But the fact is that I think that at the same time, they don't clear out the swamp in this regard because they're not aware of how bad the problem really is, because they're not talking to people like me. And that's not an advertisement or complaint. Like I say, there are plenty of other people they could be talking to that would tell them the same things. People who are in the military, Major Stephen Coughlin, who was the Pentagon's only expert on Sharia for a few years until he was fired at the behest of a Muslim, Hisham Islam, who was the assistant to the Secretary of Defense or something, some title like that, and that was in the Bush administration. They could get all kinds of people back like Coughlin. But in any case, they don't, I think, because the deep state, so-called, is very much entrenched in the intelligence and homeland security departments and the intelligence agencies. And so these people would resist any kind of attempt to reform them and bring about a more realistic approach to this threat. And they have been resisting it, and that's why there's been very little change between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in regard to how they envision the threat. Now, all that said, he has issued a national security strategy that speaks about Sharia as a problem, honor killing, and so on. And so there has been a tremendous improvement. There's just plenty of room for more.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I mean, you read some of the other things in the book I was looking at earlier that I forgot the names because I'm not familiar with them, but there was the story about Muslim Brotherhood members, one of them working for the Clinton Foundation named Jihad al-Haddad. There was the guy that Al-Amudi, who Obama commuted his sentence, even though he was in league with terrorists. There's the stories about George Bush flying the Saudis out the back door. And someone, a regular Joe like me, reads about this and says, what are they doing? Or the other day, this is not related to Islam, but I read a story about how there's all this Russian collusion that will not leave the news cycle. And Paul Kengor wrote an article about Henry Wallace, who was basically communicating in open with Russian communists and Communist Party members. And that was happening. And McCarthy's the guy who got the bad rap for saying, hey, we have too many bad eggs. So we look at that as simpletons out of Washington and go, why not just get rid of all these people? I don't understand it. So we could probably talk a while on that, but I want to make sure that we touch on some of the history points of the book. You basically talk about the series of conquests over 1,400 years and the evolution of jihad, the different ways in which it's implemented. There's some fascinating stories about everything from the Byzantine Empire to the Romans to India, and I wish we had time to talk about it. But I really want to ask you, is there anything that you did learn in writing the book? You said it's basically just a compilation of all the things you've been writing about for 2 decades. Any new revelations, anything that surprised you in pumping this one out?
Well, let me say one thing. It's not a compilation of things I've been writing about for 2 decades. This book's all new. I haven't been writing about this before. As a matter of fact, this is the first book by anyone that is a comprehensive narrative history of the entirety of the jihad warfare from the beginning to now.
Generalization. Apologize. Just your body of work. right?
What I mean is, yeah, I've been writing about Islam and Jihad for all these years, for over 20 years now, and so I was familiar with what I had to put in this book. It was just a matter of putting it together. In as far as learning something new, I suppose Akbar the Great is my favorite example for that. He was a Mughal emperor in India, 16th century, and I knew of Akbar the Great, and I knew that he was kind of eccentric, but I was surprised to see that he had actually left Islam altogether. And the jihad against India was very bloody, very brutal. But Akbar the Great grew disenchanted with Islam, and when he did, he relaxed a number of the restrictions upon the non-Muslims. And then his son Jahangir succeeded him. And one thing I did find for this book that I had not known about before was Jahangir writing about a letter that Akbar, his father, had sent him, explaining why he had relaxed the restrictions on the non-Muslims, and explaining that, you know, these were human beings like you and me, and there was no need to be so harsh and unkind to them all the time. Jahangir thought this was terrible, and as from a Muslim standpoint, restored a lot of the restrictions on the Hindus. And so it's a very clear lesson, albeit kind of a disturbing one, that when a Muslim leader became less Muslim, he became more tolerant and more magnanimous toward his non-Muslim subjects. But then when he was succeeded by another Muslim hardliner, life got bad again for the non-Muslims.
You know, before we wrap up, there's two themes I definitely want to touch on. One is Israel and this ongoing, never-ending war between Israel and Palestine. And you wrote some excellent work in the book about Palestine and this myth, and you talked about, I was pretty young when Arafat was prominent, but you talked about the KGB ties and how this was basically a propaganda campaign to create Palestine. And I've talked about this in other podcasts. I've had a couple prominent people on that you recognize, but I'm fascinated by the fact that even I'm very Christian, even the scholars that I read talk about Palestine, and they never address this issue of the fact that this is a pawn in the war of propaganda against people of the Christian covenant. So can you kind of talk about, it's going to sound far-fetched to people who haven't heard this, but talk about the Russian KGB connection to the creation of Palestine.
Sure. In the first place, it's the creation of the Palestinians. Palestine was there from 134 AD. In 134 AD, there was the Bar Kokhba revolt among the Jews in Judea. And Bar Kokhba was a messiah. He was a claimant to be the messiah among the Jews. And he led a violent revolt against the Romans. The Romans had had enough by then, and they expelled all the Jews from Judea, and they renamed it Palestine. They found the name in the Old Testament as the name of the ancient enemies of the Jews, the Philistines, and they slapped that name on the region. It was the name of a region. It was never the name of a group of people. It was never the name of a state. It was never the name of a kingdom. There was never a king or a president. There is no ethnic, linguistic, or religious difference between the Palestinians, so-called, and the Jordanians and Syrians and Lebanese Arabs who were right there next to them. And so the Palestinian nationality never existed. In 1948, when the State of Israel was established, the universal coverage, if you go back and read the newspapers of the day, referred to the Arabs and the Israelis. No, there was not a hint. Nobody whispered the name Palestinian. There were no Palestinians. Everybody understood that these were Arabs like the Arabs in the surrounding Arab states. But in the 1960s, after the Six-Day War, Israel was extremely popular in the United States. Americans love an underdog, and Israel had defeated all the Arab states around it in the Six-Day War and had gained immense respect because, of course, this was an aggressive war by those Arab states. And around this time, actually a little bit before, it was decided by the KGB and Yasser Arafat to create a new nationality to counteract the idea of this tiny Jewish state facing these violent, vicious, repressive, aggressive Arab states all around it that were huge in comparison. And they would counteract this impression that Americans most prominently had, by creating an even tinier people, the Palestinians, who were facing the horrible, aggressive Israeli war machine. And Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania, of course a satellite of the Soviet Union, was given the task of training Arafat to deal with the Western media and to speak about Zionist imperialism and racism and all the hot buttons that put the media so easily allows themselves, all the hot button issues that the media falls for all the time.
Westerners are too smart for that. This would never work.
Imperialism and so on. So the Palestinians were invented, and one of the biggest mistakes the Israelis did was to go for it and to start referring to the Palestinians instead of calling this out for the propaganda initiative that it was.
And I think is there another quote? Who was the gentleman? Was it Mushain who talked about, who admitted that the Palestinians didn't exist?
Yeah, he was a PLO operative, and he gave an interview with a Dutch newspaper in 1977 in which he said, yes, of course, there are no Palestinians. Palestinians as a nationality do not exist, and as soon as we gain independence, as soon as we destroy Israel, we will unite with Jordan because they're the same as the Arabs in Jordan.
When I'm online trolling people, it actually gives me great pride. As more of a student than an expert of the history of Israel versus Palestine, or whatever we're going to call it instead, its actual name, is the fact that for the longest time, the war was fought with the sword. When it was fought intellectually, culturally, and technologically, Israel just destroys everyone. So when they talk about stealing the land, like if the Arabs can steal back, go for it. If we're going to go with that narrative, but the fact of the matter is they're a blessed nation. They're a nation that was prophesied in the Bible, and they're going to be really, really hard to defeat as long as they stick true to the covenants they made. So it gives me a lot of pride without people, I get called a Zionist and all this, but I just am someone who understands the covenant that was made with the 12 tribes. And there's a reason they are who they are today. I want to talk also, unless you want to put any other feedback on that, the last thing I want to talk about is the dynamic for the layperson, for the one that reads the news and doesn't hear the real truth behind the story. Talk to us about the dynamic of Saudi Arabia and Iran and Jimmy Carter overthrowing the Shah. He's on his deathbed right now. I'm sorry for Jimmy Carter, but all the things that are happening in terms of the chess match with Donald Trump and the Saudis kind of sucking up to us because of the danger in Iran, and what you expect to see over the next couple of years out of the situation.
Well, I guess the main thing is that, yes, Jimmy Carter betrayed our ally, the Shah, and allowed for the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is a Shiite entity. The Saudis are Sunni, and the Sunnis rather, and the Shiites, they have hated each other for 1,400 years and frequently warred against each other. And so you have in the Saudis, it's very difficult. People say, well, they're not really an ally, and they're spreading jihad ideology all around the world, and all this is true, but at the same time, Donald Trump, I think, is being easier on them because he's trying to limit the power of Iran. And they very much want to limit the power of Iran because, I mean, they want to because it's a Sunni Shiite thing, and Donald Trump wants to because he sees Iran quite rightly as a larger geopolitical foe. But ultimately, we are going to have to reckon with the fact that the Saudis are not a reliable ally either. And they're just no good guys in this struggle.
The author of The History of Jihad, Robert Spencer, written almost 20 books on the topic. This one's been described as his best work. So far, after reading 80% of it, I have to agree. Run out and grab a copy. And remember, when you hear the word Islamophobe, it might just be someone like Robert Spencer who knows too much and who cares too much and who says too much. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today, and best of luck to you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Outstanding.